Those in favor of the draft resolution, please raise their hand. Those against? Abstentions? The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
Have you ever wondered what it would take for a country to leave the United Nations? It's a fascinating question because while the UN Charter doesn't provide any clear path for a member state to secede, history shows that some countries have flirted with the idea. And while these moments have often been born out of discontent rather than genuine intent, they still raise intriguing questions about the dynamics of global governance and the frustrations that arise within it. Take Indonesia, for instance, back in 1965. Displeased with the election of Malaysia to a non-permanent seat on the Security Council, which they saw as an extension of neocolonialism, Indonesia didn't just voice their concerns, they acted on them. They temporarily withdrew from the UN. Now, this wasn't a full break, but rather a bold move that reflected the intensity of their frustration. Interestingly, Indonesia rejoined the following year after a change in government. The UN, for its part, chose to regard this as a hiatus rather than an official departure, a diplomatic way of keeping the peace. But Indonesia's example remains rare. More often than not, modern examples of countries threatening to leave international institutions like the UN reflect political rhetoric rather than serious intent. One such case was the Philippines in 2016. President Duterte, after facing sharp criticism from the UN over his domestic policies, made headlines by blustering about exiting the organization entirely. But just as quickly as the news spread, it was dismissed by his own foreign secretary as mere posturing, a reminder that while frustration can run high, the UN remains an essential pillar of international diplomacy. Even in the United States, a country deeply embedded in the foundations of the UN, we've seen attempts to distance itself from the organization. In 2017, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act was introduced in Congress. Its goal? To end US membership in the UN. But despite the loud voices pushing it, this act was more symbolic than anything else, representing a subset of politicians' frustrations with global governance. The bill didn't gain serious traction, and like many proposals before it, it served as a political tool rather than a genuine effort to break ties. So why all the tension? What drives countries, particularly those from the global south and emerging powers like the BRICS alliance, to question the structure of the United Nations? Well, one key reason is the Security Council, the most powerful body within the UN. It's dominated by 5 permanent members: the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. These nations hold veto power, which means they can block any substantive resolution. This concentration of power, especially in Western hands, has long frustrated countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa, all of whom have no permanent seat at the table. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been vocal about their desire for reform. They argue that the Security Council, in its current form, doesn't reflect the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. After all, together these countries represent a significant share of the world's population and economic output. So why, they ask, should their voices be sidelined in the decision-making processes of the UN? Hey there! If you're enjoying this video so far, could you do me a quick favor? Please give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. And feel free to drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's not just the BRICS nations raising these concerns. The entire continent of Africa, home to 54 countries, about 28% of the UN's membership, lacks a permanent seat on the Security Council. For years, African leaders have called for greater representation, arguing that their collective influence and demographic significance deserve a place at the table. This absence of African voices in the highest echelons of global governance is a glaring gap in a system that's supposed to represent the world's nations. Beyond the UN, BRICS nations have also taken issue with global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. They argue that these bodies, much like the UN, are too heavily dominated by Western interests. Leadership positions in these organizations have traditionally gone to Europeans and Americans, even though emerging economies play a vital role in the global market. This frustration led BRICS to create their own financial institution, the New Development Bank, NDB. The NDB focuses on funding infrastructure and development projects in BRICS nations and other emerging economies. One of its key goals is to reduce reliance on the US dollar by offering loans in local currencies. It's a strategic move that reflects BRICS' broader vision, a multipolar world where power is more evenly distributed, and developing nations have a greater say in global governance. Of course, not everyone is on board with BRICS' vision for a reformed global order. Efforts to expand the Security Council to include permanent seats for developing nations face opposition from Western countries, who are reluctant to dilute their influence. But as BRICS grows in strength, and potentially in membership, the pressure for reform is only going to increase. Consider this: during global crises like the refugee waves of the past decade, the response from international institutions has often seemed inconsistent. For instance, the way Europe handled the Ukrainian refugee crisis in comparison to the Syrian or Afghan refugees has raised eyebrows. Ukrainian refugees were granted immediate rights to live, work, and access social services across the EU, while refugees from the Middle East and Africa often faced stricter controls and harsher policies. This disparity has led many to question whether the global governance system truly treats all nations and peoples equally. The BRICS nations, particularly Russia and China, have been vocal about these perceived double standards, arguing that Western countries are quick to criticize the human rights records of others while turning a blind eye to their own. This sentiment only fuels the call for a more balanced global system, one that reflects the reality of a multipolar world where emerging economies and developing nations have a fair share of influence. In recent years, another example of the Security Council's structural imbalance has come to light in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Many within the international community have grown increasingly frustrated with the US use of its veto power, particularly when it comes to blocking resolutions that criticize Israel's actions. The United States has long been a staunch supporter of Israel, and this support often translates into a protective shield for Israel in the UN. When diplomatic sessions at the UN Security Council aim to address issues surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict, other nations frequently push for resolutions condemning Israeli actions or calling for accountability. However, time and time again, these resolutions are blocked by the US, using its veto power to prevent any formal UN criticism of Israel. This dynamic has sparked outrage, particularly among countries in the Middle East and the Global South, who see it as a clear example of Western bias. The US ability to veto resolutions backed by the majority of UN members creates an impasse, leaving the international community feeling powerless to address one of the world's most long-standing conflicts. The frustration isn't just about the US protecting Israel, it's about the broader principle of fairness in global governance. Many argue that if the UN is meant to foster peace and diplomacy, no single nation should have the power to unilaterally block the will of the international community. Yet, as long as the veto power remains, the US, along with the other permanent members of the Security Council, will continue to wield an outsized influence on global affairs. As BRICS continues to expand its influence on the global stage, the possibility of reforming institutions like the UN becomes ever more real. The bloc has already made significant strides in establishing alternative structures, like the NDB, and its push for a more inclusive global order shows no sign of slowing down. If the current system resists change, BRICS may well continue building new frameworks to challenge the Western-centric model of governance. And with that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing so you stay up to date with all the latest uploads. Your support really means a lot, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Until next time.